In 2001, Camilla did something the palace has spent years desperately trying to bury. She took the Queen's tiara without her knowledge. Not just any piece. One of the most sacred and personal pieces Queen Elizabeth owned. A tiara the Queen had worn on one of the darkest and most painful days of her entire life. When Elizabeth found out what Camilla had done, she made one decision that day and never once went back on it. Not a single piece of her personal jewelry would ever go to Camilla. Ever. Camilla fought that rule with everything she had for years. Then Queen Elizabeth died. And what happened next with that jewelry was something nobody saw coming. Nobody noticed at first. That was the thing about the way Angela Kelly ran the Queen's private collection. Everything had a place. And when a member of her staff completed a routine inventory check at Windsor Castle one afternoon in the early 2000s and reached the velvet tray that held the Burmese ruby tiara, she froze. The tray was empty. The tiara was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped back from that tray like it had burned her, and she ran straight to Kelly and told her everything. Kelly's heart immediately began racing. She knew what Queen Elizabeth believed about that tiara, what those stones were supposed to do, what they were supposed to protect. She walked to the Queen's rooms, and when she got there, she could barely get the words out. Her voice was shaking. "It is gone," she said. "The whole tiara. Someone took it." The Queen went still for just 1 second. Then she stood up, pressed her hand hard against her chest, and ran straight to the vault herself. When she reached that velvet tray and saw the empty space staring back at her mouth fell open, wide open, and nothing came out. Not a single scream. The people in that room said they had never seen her look like that. She was not just upset. She was terrified. Then the rumors started moving through the household. Camilla had been in the building that day. A member of staff had watched her walk into the room where the personal collection was laid out for the audit. And the moment someone came near, Camilla had rushed out, said something about needing to be somewhere, and that she would visit the Queen again next time. Now, there was one question no one dared ask out loud. Had Camilla stolen the Queen's jewelry? The Queen was in a terrible spot. She could not stand up and announce to the world that jewelry had vanished. No, that would pull the press in like sharks. It would humiliate the monarchy. So, the search began in silence. Conversations happened in whispers behind closed doors, and the Queen became a ghost of herself. Her hands trembled all through that week. She barely ate, and here is why this piece mattered so much to her. The Burmese ruby tiara was not inherited. It was not passed down. Elizabeth built it herself in 1973, and the way she built it told you everything about what it meant to her. She took the Cartier Nissim of Hyderabad tiara, a breathtaking diamond piece given to her as a wedding gift by one of the wealthiest men who had ever lived, and she destroyed it, pulled out its diamonds. Then she combined them with 96 rubies the people of Burma had personally given her as a wedding gift in 1947. The number 96 was not chosen for decoration. In ancient Burmese tradition, rubies carried a living fire that no water and no darkness could put out. They protected the wearer from evil, from sickness, from harm. And there were exactly 96 diseases recognized in Burmese medicine, one stone for each one. Every single stone in that tiara was a specific act of protection built from fire, gold, and the faith of a people who had suffered under British rule for generations and still sent their most sacred stones to the woman on the throne. Elizabeth wore it for the first time at the state opening of Parliament in 1973. From that moment, it entered her life as a shield she strapped on when the world got dangerous. And the world got very dangerous. And somehow Queen Elizabeth really believed, that everything that happened to her would have been far worse if it weren't for that tiara. In 1992, everything collapsed at once. Her son Andrew separated from Sarah Ferguson, who had already been photographed in the south of France, having her toes sucked by her financial advisor while still a senior working royal. The photographs ran on front pages worldwide. The Queen had genuinely liked Sarah, and she watched her burn everything down in the most degrading way possible. 2 months later, her daughter, Queen Elizabeth, suffered more tragedies and finalized her divorce from Mark Phillips. A second marriage destroyed inside weeks of the first. Then in June, a book arrived that tore everything open. Andrew Morton's Diana. Her true story was built from secret recordings Diana had smuggled out of Kensington Palace. The book described how Diana threw herself down a staircase at Sandringham while pregnant. She hurt herself repeatedly while trying to end her life because of her dying marriage. The Queen was reportedly so disturbed she could not bring herself to speak directly to Charles about it for weeks. But none of these tragedies hit so deeply than the moment the Queen's home almost got destroyed. It started at 11:33 in the morning on November 20th, 1992. A restorer had left a lamp pressed against a curtain in the Queen's private chapel. The curtain caught. The fire tore through the ceiling and into the roof structure. 12 fire stations responded. 150 firefighters. Over 100 rooms were destroyed. The Brunswick Tower collapsed. The roof of St. George's Hall caved in while still burning. The ceiling of the grand reception room came down in flaming pieces. 150 million pounds of damage. Later that evening, the Queen walked the perimeter of Windsor Castle in a long wax jacket with her hands behind her back. The people who stood close to her described her eyes as shattered in a way her face refused to show. She had hidden in that castle during the war as a child. She had walked those rooms her entire life, and she stood there and watched them burn. In the chaos of the evacuation, staff rushed to carry personal objects out by hand through smoke-filled hallways. And here is something that has long been rumored. Some of the Queen's most personal jewelry pieces were inside the castle that day, including the Burmese ruby tiara. A few pieces did not survive, but the Burmese ruby tiara did not suffer a single scratch. Staff who were there that night claimed the Queen picked it up from the rubble, held it in both hands, and kissed it while her heart broke into pieces around her. 4 days later, the Queen stood at the Guildhall and called 199 to her annus horribilis, her horrible year. Her voice broke. It was one of the only times in her public life that private pain crossed her face in front of an audience. That same month, she wore the Burmese ruby tiara. In fact, through each one of these tragedies, she wore it. Somehow, it gave her hope and the strength to keep going. It reminded her that the storm would always pass, that she would survive, that the 96 stones were still holding the line between her and something worse. So when that tiara went missing in the late part of 2001, the Queen panicked. What would happen now? Would she have the strength to keep going without it? From that moment, a feeling settled over her that she could not shake. A feeling like something was coming, something unlike anything she had ever faced before. 3 weeks later, something happened that nobody inside that household ever forgot. Camilla walked in herself, carrying the tiara. She looked completely innocent. She walked straight up to Elizabeth and hugged her, even though the Queen did not open her arms. Then she held out the tiara with a bright smile and said, "Thank you for letting me have it." A cold fury flashed behind the Queen's eyes. She held it back. She told Camilla quietly that she had been looking for the tiara and that Camilla had no right to take it. Camilla's smile did not move. She said she had no idea the Queen had been looking for it. She said she had taken it with a clean heart. None of that was true. Reports from inside the household claimed Camilla had worn the tiara at a private party during those 3 weeks. She had heard that the Queen was losing her mind searching for it, and her response when she heard that were 3 words. "Who cares anyway?" The Queen said nothing more. But her mind was made up in that moment. Camilla would never come near any of these jewels again. Not one of them. Not ever. The tiara was back in her hands, but the Queen never stopped feeling that something had been broken that could not be repaired. The energy was disturbed. The protection had been interrupted, and the feeling that something horrible was on its way never left her. In February 2002, something devastating happened. Princess Margaret suffered a massive stroke. Margaret had already been fragile, had suffered smaller strokes the year before, had badly scalded both feet in a bath accident that left her partially unable to walk and in constant pain. But this final stroke came fast and brutal in the weeks immediately following the disturbance of the tiara. She died on February 9, 2002. Margaret was not simply the Queen's sister. She was the only person left alive who had shared Elizabeth's entire beginning. They had hidden together in Windsor Castle during the war as small children, played in the same nursery, and wore the same clothes. Elizabeth lost the last person who had known her before she became the Queen. Just 2 months later, in April 2002, the Queen Mother died at 101. The woman who had refused to leave London during the war when every advisor told her to go, who had walked the bombed streets of the East End in her hat and her pearls and her absolute refusal to be broken, was gone 2 months after Margaret. Elizabeth never recovered after those deaths, and she believed that something had a hand in them. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't been at her best after the disappearance of that tiara. Maybe she blamed herself for feeling that something bad would happen, and it did. Maybe she blamed herself for those deaths. No one knows. But she made a very tough decision. No one tainted with evil would ever come near her most sacred jewels. In her own words, anyone who didn't deserve to wear them would never wear them. Not while she had breath in her body. After the funerals, she told Kelly that the Burmese ruby tiara and several other personal pieces were to be moved to a separate secure location, accessible only to Kelly and the Queen herself. No written record of this entered any public document, but it was followed without question from that day forward. The Burmese ruby tiara has not been seen publicly since the Queen's death. But the story of what Elizabeth refused to surrender does not end with one tiara. There are other pieces, each one carrying its own history of blood and grief and conquest. Each one with its own dark reason to stay out of Camilla's hands. The diamond. The diamond ripped from a child king. The coronation necklace. Elizabeth wore the coronation necklace the way a soldier wears a scar. She never layered it with other jewelry the way previous queens had done because she understood that what it carried was already heavier than anything that could be placed next to it. From her coronation in 1953 to the final years of her reign, not once did she offer it to another woman. And the reason it weighed what it did goes back to a 10-year-old boy whose diamond sits at its center to this day. In 1849, British soldiers dismantled one of the most powerful kingdoms in Asia, dragged a child named Dulip Singh off his throne, separated him from his mother, shipped him across the world, and took the most valuable stone from his treasury. That stone became the Lore Diamond, a 22-carat centerpiece inside a necklace worn at every British coronation for the next 170 years. And the child they took it from spent the rest of his life trying to get it back and died broken and alone before he ever came close. Dulip Singh was the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire. His father Ranjit Singh had built that empire into something formidable, a kingdom that stretched across northern India and held its own against every British pressure during his lifetime. When Ranjit died and the regencies that followed collapsed into chaos, the East India Company moved in with military force. 2 brutal wars followed. Dulip Singh was torn from his throne, separated from his mother, Rani Jindal, who was imprisoned and then exiled to Nepal, transported to Britain, and converted to Christianity. When Dulip Singh grew up, he fought back with everything he had for everything that was ever taken from him. He lost each one. He died in Paris in 1893 in a cheap hotel room at 55 years old. Impoverished, stateless, estranged from most of his children. The diamond seized from him at 10 years old had by then already been worn at 2 British coronations. His name appears in no official record connected to the stone. The necklace itself was constructed in 1858 by the Royal Jewellers Gar from a darkness of its own. Queen Victoria had lost a magnificent collection of diamonds and pearls to her uncle, the King of Hanover, after a legal battle that dragged on for decades. She was now desperate to build a jewel that would be greater than all the diamonds she had lost. So she went into her own vaults, pulled out the ceremonial swords and obsolete weaponry sitting unused for years, dismantled them, and had the stones used to build replacements. The coronation necklace was constructed from the material of broken weapons, with a seized child's diamond at its center. Elizabeth wore that necklace at Philip's funeral in April 2021. She sat alone in the pew at St. George's Chapel, separated from her family by COVID restrictions. A small figure in black with that necklace at her throat and no one beside her. She never offered it to another woman. She never even considered it. These pieces carried heavy energy, dark energy, energy she did not trust in the wrong hands. Camilla had once made a remark, casual and bright, that she wished to wear the coronation necklace someday. Just like that, like it was simply a matter of waiting. That remark reached the Queen, and the Queen, in the quiet way she said the things that cut deepest, said that perhaps Camilla could wear it in her next life, if she was worth it even then. The coronation necklace carried a child king's seized diamond at its center, and Elizabeth bore that weight alone for 70 years. The next piece is even darker than this. It carries the chips from the crown itself. Elizabeth wore the Cullinan brooch as a weapon. It was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen for authority. She wore it when she needed to communicate something that words would have made smaller. And for 70 years, it never left her body for anyone else's. Not under any circumstance. Those two diamonds were cut from the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found in human history. The Cullinan diamond, discovered in January 1905 in a mine in South Africa, weighed 3,106 carats and was roughly the size of a closed adult fist. The ground it came from had been black South African land. The men who dug that tunnel every day had no legal rights, no ownership claims, and no share in what was being pulled from the earth beneath them. Their names appear nowhere in any official record connected to the stone. The diamond found in their ground was purchased by the South African government, presented to King Edward VII as a birthday gift, and shipped to Amsterdam, where the Asher brothers cut it into 9 major stones. The 2 biggest pieces were used to make the king's crown and the royal scepter, the 2 most sacred objects in the entire British monarchy. The pieces that were left over became a brooch, but those leftovers were enormous. Together, they weighed over 150 carats. They came from the exact same stone as the diamonds used to make that crown and scepter. Same diamond, just different pieces of it. And Elizabeth treated that brooch exactly like what it was, a piece of the crown itself. She wore them at the state opening of Parliament year after year. She wore them publicly in the weeks after Diana's death in 1997, when the crowds outside the palaces were demanding visible grief, and the institution was under the most serious pressure of its modern existence. Elizabeth knew that to give those stones to another woman would be to hand her a piece of the crown itself. And for 70 years, those diamonds never left her body for anyone else's. Not once. People close to the Queen described a specific and unsettling pattern they noticed. When Camilla was in rooms that contained the collection, she looked at pieces with an intensity that made staff uncomfortable. She asked about specific items, their histories, their valuations, their storage locations. One former lady in waiting described her as having a collector's eye, meaning she studied the collection the way a person studies something they are already planning to own. She told a close friend privately that she would outlast the restrictions, that she would get what she wanted eventually. The next piece Elizabeth inherited was built entirely from grief, and it began with Queen Victoria, the crown she built from her own grief. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert stopped breathing at Windsor Castle. He was 42 years old, and Queen Victoria held his hand when it happened. What she did in the hours immediately afterward is something that is almost impossible to absorb even now. She had a cast made of Albert's face, and both his hands while his body was still warm. For the remaining 39 years of her life, she slept every single night with a plaster cast of his right hand beside her in the bed. Every morning, his clothes were laid out fresh, as though he were alive and about to return to dress. Hot water was brought to his shaving basin on schedule, his chamber pot cleaned and replaced daily. The rituals of his living presence maintained in his rooms at Windsor until her own death in 1901. She wore black every single day for 39 years without a single deviation. Albert had died of typhoid fever contracted from the sewage system beneath Windsor Castle, a system palace engineers had flagged as dangerously unsanitary for years in reports that were ignored. The darker theory, carried quietly by historians, is that Albert was already being consumed by stomach cancer, and the typhoid only finished what was already inevitable. Either way, Victoria watched him die slowly over weeks, sat beside him through every day of it, held his hand when he stopped breathing, and emerged from that room a completely different person. 9 years into that grief, Victoria commissioned the miniature crown. She removed diamonds from her own personal necklace, stones she had worn against her own skin, and had them reset into a tiny silver crown set with 1,187 of her own stones. She did not use stones from the state collection. She used her own. The crown was built from her body outward to sit on top of the white widow's cap she wore on her head every single day. She wore it at her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, and at every major state occasion of her later reign. When she died at Osborne House on January 22, 1901, the crown was placed on her coffin. What almost nobody knows is what else went into that coffin. Victoria had left specific instructions. The plaster cast of Albert's right hand was to be placed inside the coffin beside her body and covered with flowers, so that mourners standing at the casket could not see it. She was buried holding the hand of the man she had lost 39 years before. The crown was placed on top of Victoria's coffin during the funeral procession and the lying in state. It sat on the coffin while mourners filed past, but it was not buried with her. After the funeral, it was returned to the royal collection. Then in 1937, King George VI had it deposited in the Jewel House at the Tower of London. Elizabeth never retrieved this crown from the Tower of London, where it had been placed in 1937. For 70 years, she left it alone in the dark, and she did this deliberately with full knowledge of what she was choosing. This was the most specific act of protection in her entire management of the collection. She understood what the crown was. It was not a tiara. It was a burial object built from one woman's body and one woman's unending sorrow. To bring it out, to place it on a living head, would have been a desecration. She gave Victoria's grief the only dignity still available to it: silence, stillness, and the dark. Victoria's grief was sealed permanently into